Let's turn to the big story. It has been 1 week since the historic heat wave hit the Pacific Northwest. Historic and deadly. And each day we learn about more deaths being blamed on this extreme heat. As of today, that number is at 107 people across the state of Oregon. At least 67 of those people died in Multnomah County. I got this email from Katie. She said, "Hey Dan, what would be great reporting on the heat deaths would be a map of where they all were. I would almost bet that they would not be uniformly spread out through Portland." And Katie, you're correct there. And we have the map. We'll take a look at it. This is where people died in Multnomah County. The darker the color on this map, the more people died in that zip code. The county released this data on Friday, so it is missing some of the newer death reports that we have learned since Friday. But at the time, the county said that no more than 5 people died in each of the zip codes that you see here. We also pinpointed where the county opened cooling centers during the heat wave, and you could see they were kind of spread out all over the city, but not in that darkest area in southeast Portland, which had the highest number of deaths. We should also note only 3 of these cooling centers were actually open 24 hours. And when it got up to 115 degrees, it was pretty hot 24 hours at a time. Now, let's take a closer look at those darker parts of the map in southeast Portland. 97266, which is the zip code for Lents, had the highest number of deaths. That's one of the poorer neighborhoods in the city, with 20% of people living below the poverty line. The next highest number of deaths happened in 97233 and 97206. The first zip code is part of the Centennial and Rockwood neighborhoods. That's also one of the poorest areas in our community, with 38% of people living below the poverty line. The other zip code is part of the Mount Scott and Woodstock neighborhoods, and that area is more in line with the average income levels for Portland as a whole, with 12% of people below the poverty line. Here's what else we know. The county told us that the majority of people who died were white. 45% of the victims were men and 22 were women. They were between the ages of 44 and 97. The county says they don't know how many, if any, of these people were homeless, but they did tell us that most people died alone in their homes without air conditioning and without a fan. Again, this is just for Multnomah County. At least 40 other people across the state also died in this heat, including a migrant farm worker in Marion County. Sebastian Francisco Perez recently came to Oregon from Guatemala and hoped to make enough money for his wife to start fertility treatment. He was 38 years old. He was found dead during the heat wave after moving irrigation lines at Ernst Nursery and Farms in St. Paul. Over the weekend, you see this. This was a vigil. People showed up, people who knew Perez, some of them, calling for changes to prevent more heat-related deaths like his. And that is the big question really now moving forward. How do we prevent something like this from happening again? I spoke with Multnomah County Commissioner Jessica Vega Peterson about that, and her idea is to send out emergency alerts to people's phones. You might have gotten some during the wildfires last September if you were in one of the evacuation zones, and she thinks extreme heat should be treated as just as big of an emergency.
That is not something that is currently used. But this is clearly a deadly event. This is clearly something where lives are lost and people need to know how to prepare and what they can do to get help. And so that's something that I would love to see us start using in the future. It's going to let people know what kind of temperatures to expect. I think it could alert people to where cooling centers are, let people know like where they can go for additional help if they need it. Remind people to check on their neighbors, to check on their family members, even, people that they may just think are socially isolated and at risk, because that is where we saw so many of these deaths were people who were by themselves and isolated.
How big of a challenge is it to reach out and find the people who aren't connected? It tends to be, in a lot of these cases, what I'm hearing now is, as you mentioned, with people being isolated, a lot of the people were alone. They didn't have an air conditioning. They didn't have a fan. In some cases, they may not have a computer. They may not have a cell phone. How difficult is it to be able to cross that barrier without the use of the technology we've become pretty used to using in these emergencies?
Yeah. I mean, it is such a sad thought to think about the people who were alone during this and experiencing this heat and not knowing where to go for help or not having anybody to reach out to for help. And I think we all have to do a better job of taking care of each other and reaching out to our neighbors. I think it's an incredible challenge. I mean, people, by the word, they're isolated. They don't have those social connections. They don't have those community connections. And I think it's something that's important for all of us to step forward and to do that additional outreach. We're much more isolated society today, it seems, than we were, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I think things like this heat wave and the deadly impacts it has shows us why it's so important to change that dynamic and to change that trend and really look out for each other and take care of one another.